Hey there, are you grieving the potential loss of a loved one or feeling overwhelmed with the loss of someone you care about? If so, you're in the right place. Lisa Hartung here, and this podcast is designed to guide you through topics surrounding death and dying. We'll dive into multifaceted aspects of grief, offering you a blend of personal stories, expert insights, and practical advice for your grief journey. May this be a safe space for you to learn, listen, and ask questions about your own life and loved ones. So grab your favorite beverage and let's dive in. Welcome back to another episode of Giving Grief Grace. This week, I'm really excited to share with you that we'll be doing a mini series. So we have 3 episodes that will be upcoming, all on how to talk to children about death and dying and about grief. This week kicks off the start of our mini series. We are working with A Haven, which is a nonprofit grief support center for children and families in Exton, Pennsylvania. This week, I'm super excited to welcome Carrie Silver, the clinical director at A Haven, to the show. And she is a licensed professional counselor and a community advocate. She's highly motivated to support the emotional well-being of children, adolescents, young adults, and their families. She has over 15 years of experience and expertise in diverse settings that span grief, traditional and community-based mental health services, and crisis intervention. So this conversation is not to be missed. Anyone can walk away with something that will help them with their grieving journey and help someone else. So please, without further ado, welcome to the show, Carrie Silver. Super excited to have Carrie Silver on board with us today. Welcome to the show, Carrie.
Thank you so much, Lisa. We are so glad to be here.
Oh my goodness. I've admired your work from afar, was connected with you through a mutual connection who spoke so highly of A Haven. And I would love for you to share a little bit, before we dive in, a little bit about what A Haven does for the community. It's just such an integral community support network that I think so many different areas around the country and even around the world could really benefit from. So I would love for you to just kind of share a little bit about what A Haven does and how you support the community, and then we
Sure.
can dive in.
Happy to. So, A Haven is a nonprofit center, as you mentioned, in Exton, Pennsylvania, which happens to be in Chester County, Pennsylvania, kind of the lower corner, if you will. And A Haven really exists to be a community support model for grievers of any age 3 to 25 and their families. We believe that grief is best supported in community. And so we don't follow a traditional mental health model in terms of like family or one-on-one counseling. All of our approach is through groups. We do that on site at our place in Exton for families who have experienced any kind of human loss. And then also knowing that for any number of reasons, not everybody can come to our facility, we also do it in schools. Schools are a second home for kids, and they don't turn the grief off when they go to school. And so making sure that buildings and professionals in those buildings have all the skills that they need to support grieving children, as well as that grievers have the ability to find other grievers in building and know some ways to care for themselves and remember their person well is really important to us. And then we also do a lot of community outreach. We do professional development. We do all kinds of presentations throughout the community because unfortunately, as a culture, we don't always grieve well and are kind of uncomfortable talking about it. And then also as mental health professionals and school providers, for instance, we don't really get a lot of training and continual education ourselves on how to support grief well. And so that is a really necessary gap, as this is a normal life event that happens for people that we are really thrilled to have the opportunity to fill. And so that is our greatest hope.
I am just so amazed. You've called it all out. And I know that that was the foundation of A Haven is,
Mhm.
the founders kind of looked at the map and said, where's the biggest need for this type of support to support in that gap? And, they always say it takes a village, and it really does. And so going into schools and helping have support people for students and for teachers, it's such a gift. And so today we really wanted to focus on it's okay to say died.
Mhm.
and, how to talk to children about death at any age. And so you'd shared a statistic, and I would love for you to share it live, what the percentage is of children who experience a loss in their family before they graduate.
Yes, absolutely. So, a great resource for this, because I know you luckily have listeners all over.
Mhm.
We use Judy's House. It's called the CBEM model, and they are based out of Colorado, and they're kind of like a national clearinghouse for all data related to children's grief. So, anybody who's also interested about their own community numbers
Yeah.
could go there and look by area to just get informed about their own specific context. The context I get to work in Pennsylvania, 1 in 7 children by the age of 18 will have lost either a parent or sibling. And
Mm.
so that's substantial. When you think about a classroom or a school bus, that could be 2 to 3 kids per setting, if you will. And so that is a very present experience that's happening. And we know grief impacts the whole person. And so a child, regardless of how long ago the death occurred, it can still be really impactful to them through the lifetime. And so knowing that, again, in my county, up to 8,000 children are grieving at any given time, that is something we want to make sure they have adequate support for. Really, child experiencing a death is part of the adverse childhood experiences. It's one of the most common. And so grief work is as much current supportive as it is preventative for other less helpful strategies that could be developed to support the pain and understandable experience of grief. And so that is another reason a haven exists, and we're so glad to be here.
Yeah, and I even think about, every child and every person grieves differently. And I've had people that I've interviewed on the podcast, and we had one woman who was in her 70s and didn't have these tools as a young child when she lost her father before
Mhm.
the age of 10. And
Mm.
she said, "What would life have looked like had I
Yes,
had this support?" We had
yes.
another person that lost her brother when she was young. And she said, "Wow, I didn't do my grieving until I was in my 20s and 30s because I didn't have the tools." Oh, so thank you for
Yes.
what you do. It's so vitally important.
We're happy to
Um,
do it.
and so, you're working with this younger population
Mhm.
and kids as young as 3 years old. So when a young child says, "Where did grandma go? Is daddy coming back?" Is there something that you wish parents knew about how to answer that honestly, but also gently?
Sure. Absolutely. And so, our very youngest friends, kind of in that 3-year-old preschool age, they are building their awareness of how life works every day. Everything
Yeah.
from where do I put my shoes
Mm.
to, how do I, this meal happens at the same time every day. And so everything is new to them, including the experience of death. They have no emotional framework for what that is. That
Mm.
is really ours that we can choose the amount we put with it. So for our youngest friends, we definitely recommend and research supports using real words and going slow and knowing just like everything else, it's going to have a lot of repetition to it. And
Mm.
so it's okay. And it really starts just that earliest awareness of this is such an important thing that happened. It gets to have its own language. It gets to have its own uniqueness. And so that is a wonderful gift to be able to give kids, even at the earliest of ages, because they don't understand that somehow this is different than they went to the store. It's ours to build that this is different and why. But that means we also have to use real words, and we're probably going to have the conversation many times.
Hmm. Yeah, I've heard you have to communicate 6 times
Mm,
before the news or the information really sinks in. And it's
yes.
helpful if it's in different ways.
Yes,
Uh,
absolutely.
and so, are there other areas where you talk about having this conversation? It's hard for the adult because they are probably grieving at the same time because it's a loved
Yes.
one. And so that's just all within its own difficulties. And so are you normalizing the word died or instead of saying like passed away or went to sleep? Is that something that is really important so that the child doesn't get confused?
Yes, we would absolutely advocate for that. The language of death,
Mm.
dying, dead is super important to use. The wonder about using softer phrases comes from a good place, right? Again, because
Yeah.
we know what we're
Mhm.
actually communicating and the weight of that. And so the cultural expectation is if I use lesser words, somehow the weight is less. But
Mm.
especially for children who tend to be a little bit literal, it
Right?
adds to confusion. So if we say somebody went to sleep, well, then why don't we wake them up? And so now you're actually having a different conversation. Or what happens when I go to sleep? Am I going to be able to wake up because somebody else went to sleep and didn't wake up? Or if we say we lost somebody, well, we can do something about that. First off, sometimes kids internalize like if they've lost something, I did something to make that happen then. And
Mm.
also, there's work to be done to go find that person. And if I can't find that person, then again, I maybe did something that somehow this person is still lost. And so you can see where it adds to the confusion, where we're trying to avoid some emotional impact. We might be adding others, whether it be anxiety or blame or shame, things like that. And
Mm.
so again, allowing that clarity is the kindest thing you can offer the child. And what you're really doing is showing like, I'm going to be a safe person who's going to tell you the truth. The truth is often and sometimes hard. And
Mm.
so using real words allows the child to understand the uniqueness of this experience, the permanence of this experience, and the completely separateness of this experience. It's not something we are currently experiencing like sleep. It's not something we caused, like something being lost. And
Right.
so you're actually offering the child the very thing you want them to have the most, the connection to you, the connection to the truth, and completely separate from anything they contributed by using the most real words about it.
Mm. And when you're using these real words and having these conversations, is there any specific phrasing that you might suggest or an approach to that could be helpful? We want to make it as soft as possible, but you're so right, and that it needs to be clear. In giving feedback to adults, we say kind and clear, specific and sincere. But I think that could be for feedback for anyone. And just talking through these really heartfelt situations, would just be
Yes.
interested if you have any suggestions
Yeah, and it's going to be so kid specific,
yeah,
right?
so true.
Sometimes kids are going to hear and not say anything back, and sometimes they're going to start with a lot of questions, and it can be a whole range of things. And so
Mm.
knowing the child's baseline is always going to be the best starting place.
Yeah.
Oftentimes doing it in and some kind of activity, right? So while you take a walk, while
Mm.
you take a drive, while you sit and color together, so that it gives the child also an outlet to start moving some of that energy that is naturally going to build up. One, because even if they don't understand what you're saying, they can feel how you feel about talking about it. And so some energy is going to come up for them too. And so just a way to help move that along, always with a posture of curiosity. I wonder what this sounds like when you hear this. I wonder if you're noticing any things in your head or your heart when you hear this. And so just knowing that this is not a singular conversation, kind of to our first point. It's an ongoing kind of in snips, if you will. And so allowing both the curiosity and the permission of like, hey, even if this feels like a lot to talk about right now, we can talk about this whenever you want to. You can always come talk to me about it. So that posture of like, this is an open dialogue is just always a good idea, even for our youngest friends, because they understand, even if they don't understand the death yet, they understand this is something important enough that my caregiver, my other important person in my life is willing to keep talking about it with me.
Yeah, and it's that open space, leaving the door open. And I love that you also talked about curiosity, right? When they are able to engage and tell you how they feel, then that gives them the autonomy to have those feelings and,
Yes.
validate them.
Yes.
And I think that that's such an important piece because in grief, we can feel so helpless. So if there are words that we can talk about, or even we talk about art therapy. So I love that you said while you're doing something, right, to
Mhm.
to channel that energy is just for any age is really cathartic.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely. It's okay to even just model, like,
yeah.
this is hard for me to talk to you about, or I notice I'm really sad when I'm saying these things, or I'm
Mhm.
actually confused about some of the things that I still want to tell you, but I haven't even made sense of it yet. Those
Mm.
are all things to just communicate, and it starts to lay some of that emotional vocabulary. It shows that as a grown up, I'm even having feelings about all of this. And it can just be a really supportive experience, even if it's not a full understanding.
Yeah. And one thing that A Haven does is you have the group sessions and you have the school sessions as well. So yes, we're talking about one-on-one conversations that you might have with a family member, but
Mm-hmm.
we're also having these conversations in the wider setting. It's something that keeps on coming up. And I'm curious if at Giving Grief Grace talk a lot about legacy and how we celebrate a person after they have passed. And is that
Mm-hmm.
part of the curriculum or are part of the talking points that you use when
Yes,
you're working with?
we are huge fans of creating rituals within your family, keeping photos available and active, whatever that looks like in your family, and really bringing your person along to what things that they are physically going to miss out on. And so, sometimes, for instance, at like significant milestones, weddings, things like that, you might see a picture of a missed loved one in that, but there's other ways to incorporate that too, even in like ongoing family photos or perhaps around a major holiday that your family separates, that there might be a place setting or maybe just some kind of moment of observation of that person being with you at the table in a different way. And
Mm,
so we really encourage all of those things. And if I can circle back just for a moment, one of the reasons A Haven really chooses that peer-to-peer model and the community-based grief is because we know everybody in a family grieves a little different.
yeah.
And not all relationships of the person who's no longer with us
Mm,
are warm or like especially
yeah.
if you have like a situation where maybe the caregivers were divorced and one of them has died, the child, has a different relationship then with that other remaining caregiver of who and how to talk about their person. And so maybe they're missing a model of like someone who cries and actively and earnestly misses their person. And so by being able to be in a community setting, regardless of relationship, you're able to see all the grief can happen in all different kinds of ways. And so, someone who does or doesn't do something at home can receive that from other people in their community. And so, whether you create that through a grief center or just even allowing your own personal network to be a part of this with your family, the rituals, just the day in and day out grief is so important because everybody moves at their own pace and they have different ways they emote about this. And we never want to communicate a message to anybody that somehow there's a right way to grieve and a wrong way to grieve. And so group observation, whatever that group may be, is really important to that.
Mm. Yeah, and I love that you said grief is an observation and everyone does it differently. And I think that that's something that even as adults, say a year has passed and someone might say, oh, well, can't you just get over it? And that's
Mhm.
something that is really a foundation of this podcast is that, grief is nonlinear and you don't just get over it. It's something that could come up throughout life. And so you've talked about in the past how children change and how
Mhm.
grief looks as they age. So maybe they lost a parent between 3 and 5.
Mhm.
And what does that then look like at 10 or at 18?
Mhm.
And there are different
Mhm.
conversations that you have throughout that journey. So I would love for you to kind of share how you go about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can share some kind of normative experiences at different ages so you can see how it kind of progresses.
Yeah.
And I think, kind of what we've already been talking about. Let's say a 50-year-old person lost a parent or sibling. Their grief experience is just going to be completely different than a 7-year-old loses a parent or sibling. And it's not like, oh, once that 7-year-old becomes a grown-up, now they kind of switch to adult mode of grieving. A
Mm,
grief experience that happens in childhood is going to last a lifetime. The impact and the intensity of it can keep shifting, but this isn't a box to be checked. It's never going to be done. And so it's okay to recognize, like, to your point, we're not going to get over it. What we don't want to get over it in one sense.
yeah.
We would like to reduce its impact and its intensity, but
Mm,
you're never going to stop loving your person. You're never going to stop missing your person. And so all throughout your lifetime, that will present in a number of different ways. And even as I get a chance to share, some of these experiences across the lifetime, these are what we would consider normative. We would not consider them pathological. Their impact might present challenges, and there's wonderful, great opportunities for support, but these are not indications that something is wrong. These are actually indications the child is doing the work of grief, and sometimes that's just hard for their grown-ups. And so the things I'd like to share with you about the kind of the different ages, these are considered like of a child of like a normal developmental process. There would be different considerations for children who are neurodivergent, developmentally delayed, things like that. And so even maybe someone who is listening to this who has a child who is not on a normal developmental process right now, this can still be helpful because think about it more like capacity or maturity. Where do they line up versus like their chronological age? This can still be really helpful information. And so for, our very youngest friends, think kind of that like preschool, very early elementary space. That child is going to have a very hard time even accepting the permanence of the death experience. And so it would not be unusual for that child to still talk about their person in the present tense, still talk about things they're going to get to do with their person. And that would just be normal. That's not a sign that they're unwilling to accept or something like, not everything in their life is permanent right now. And so that would be expected to happen and yet also still hard for their remaining caregivers. Magical thinking is very much at play that somehow there's something they can do to bring their person back, or that maybe there was something catastrophic they did to help this occur. And so that's not unusual, as well as kind of fantasy that also maybe some of their characters that they love were somehow involved in their death story, if you will.
Yeah.
And it's really important to remember that at this age, the emotional vocabulary greatly lags behavior. And so they might be feeling sad, they might be feeling mad, they might be feeling confused. They do not have words for that. They have behaviors for that. And so again, what we might describe as like, they just seem like they're throwing temper tantrums all the time. Like, yeah, they don't have the words for all this feeling that they have in their body. And so presents a lot of challenges, also considered normal within this experience at this age. Also would not be unusual to see regressions, sleep regressions, potty regressions, just independently functioning in life, can't get themselves dressed, all of those kinds of things. Very normal. And it would not also be unusual for them as part of their reality testing to talk about this all the time, especially with strangers. Like, okay, this is what I hear at home. What if I tell somebody else when I'm in the store? What if I tell somebody else at school? And so, sometimes we'll have caregivers be like, oh my gosh, their teacher called. They're telling all their peers at school. Yes, they're trying to figure out, does everybody believe this? Does everybody react the same when I talk about this? They're working it out. And so all of those things would be completely expected at kind of that younger kid age.
Yeah. And, not having those words to speak and not having that language yet is why it's helpful to have a community setting, and so they can learn from their peers, right? And so do you see anything if there's a under 10-year-old child, and then once they hit 10, what does that look like? Or I don't know if there's a magic number that kind of it shifts developmentally, but would love to hear how that changes over time.
You're exactly right. It's not as much a number, but the numbers often line up with some cognitive shifts and some awareness shifts. And so that is kind of, again, when we see that next bump. And so that kind of later elementary, really early middle school tween age, if you will, sometimes we've started to get a little bit more of an emotional vocabulary. So we're kind of straddling that place. I have some words, but I still often lead with my behaviors. And so whether it's kind of the really emotional or just responses to things that seem disproportionate to whatever just happened. And so again, a lot of these times you're thinking like, okay, is this grief or is this just puberty? And sometimes it's both, right? As it will be with many things. At this age, you start to see a little bit more emergence of anxiety, very concerned with safety, their own safety, the safety of other people. Again, that awareness of like, I may not have caused that thing that happened, but I could really try to prevent anything else from happening. So again, it's that little bit of magical thinking that there is not actually proportionate control, and yet they're really trying to find it and work with that. They are usually by this point now aware of the permanence. And so that could cause like a whole regrieving, like where before they just weren't sure. Now they know their person's not here. Now they know for sure their person is not going to be at dinner or graduation, if you will. And so the big things, the little things, there's an awareness of that. And so you will also suddenly oftentimes experience like a real increase in questioning. They want to know more details. They want to know maybe things that they felt like they missed. If this was something that happened historic, or if it is something that happened recent to this actual age, they want to feel like they are part of the circle who knows the things. And so this again can provide real challenges for the caregiver, again, of their own comfort with sharing things.
Mhm.
And again, our guidance would still be real words, real things that happened, especially with what children just kind of are aware of in our culture. There actually isn't too much that would be surprising to them or overwhelming to them. They are very aware when information is being withheld. And then that often will then start drawing questions of trust.
Right.
And we'd rather preserve the trust and help them understand the words or the concepts that we're sharing.
Right, because you want to be a safe haven for them and help them through this
Exactly.
journey. And when you talk about re-grieving, right, they're experiencing it all over again. Now having more dialogue and life, just life experience. And maybe other friends have at this point lost someone as
Mhm.
well. As you said, 1 in 7 in your county. So
Yes.
again, why it's so important to have community in there. And question if so, if that's like the tween age, is there an 18? Because you work with individuals up to
Yep.
25. So
Mhm.
do you see a difference in, the 18 to 25 range that might be different than the middle school, early high school?
Absolutely. Even through high school and then into young adulthood,
Yeah.
certainly they're more aware of how they're trying to launch into a world their person doesn't exist. Depending on how long ago the death happened, they may be aware now that how much longer of a life they've lived without their person than with them. And that can be a thing that they need to process. Oftentimes, if the death happened at a younger age, they feel like they might not remember their person. And again, that's why those rituals we talked about and kind of keeping their person active in their life is really important. And so, for us, of any age of child that a child either doesn't have or feels like they cannot access their memories, we hold space for wishes. What do you wish you could talk to your person about? What do you wish you could do with your person? Because that is equally as valuable and equally as contributory as keeping their person active in their life. It's not unusual for this age group to use a lot of dark humor. For instance, we had a group of high school guys who all of them were bonded over they had all lost their father, and they called themselves the Dead Dad Club. And that would feel really appalling to a lot of people, but it worked for them and it gave them a sense of ownership of their experience. But you're still going to see a lot of emotional dysregulation at this time, especially around any times where they wish they had access to their person, whether that is for advice or activity or anything like that. You might see a lot of physicality kind of reemerge, maybe being overtired, loss of appetite. Sometimes just that what we would describe almost as like a failure to launch. Like, can I
Mhm.
move into this world, whether that be through secondary education, a career, an adult-based relationship, and how does that look? And so that would not be unusual. Again, these are all the normative things that present a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunity for support.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that in terms of relationships, right? If you lost a parent when you were young, and then I even think about that as myself having lost my mom right when my daughter was 1. How do
Mhm.
you parent? I don't have someone or a close person to be able to show, or a loving relationship, right? If you lost a parent at a young age and the remaining parent didn't chose to not have another relationship. And what does that look like? And what does a heteronormative, you know, look of family look like and upbringing? And yeah, it's important to call that out and give space to talk about it. Is there any work that or s- sayings that you might suggest to parents who are grieving either the loss of a child alongside this individual or who have lost their spouse? What's the most important thing that they can do when it's really hard for them to even get up every day because the grief can be so crippling?
Absolutely. I think the first thing I would lead with is perspective, just
Mhm.
reminding them that this is a long journey.
Yeah.
This is not something we're going to finish, and that is meant to be supportive and encouraging, not as like a, oh, I'm always going to feel this way, because they won't. The intensity and the impact, it will change. But this is an oxygen mask kind of situation. They do need to continue to care for themselves. That's why bringing in other important people that were already in their lives, because you might not get out of bed that day, and that's okay. Do you have someone else who could come over and make sure the kiddos get fed or get to school? Oftentimes, communities rally because they just don't know what to do. And so saying, like, hey, can you just make sure they get on the bus is actually a gift you give to your community and a gift you give to yourself. And all of those things are good and fine. It's not unusual for kiddos to kind of be out of sync with their caregiver. This is almost like a dance that you will have to figure out. And so on a day you're very upset, a kiddo might feel like I shouldn't be upset because mom, for instance, is already so upset, or vice versa. And so all that permission giving, all that curiosity, and just naming it out loud. I'm having a rough day. I don't think I'm going to have a rough day tomorrow because yesterday I didn't have a rough day, but today just happens to be a hard day. And sometimes we're going to have those hard days. Like just normalizing that, giving language to it can be so good and supportive. And yeah, just really leaning into your community, whoever that is.
Yes, and I love that you said that leaning in because sometimes it's really hard for people to know what you need. And
Mhm.
saying, I'm here for you, whatever you need is really, it's a nice thing to say, but
Yes.
it's so much better when the grieving person can really clearly articulate what they need. And having been there, it's really hard to know what you need.
Yes.
But saying, okay, I woke up in the morning, I literally can't get the kids on the bus.
Yeah.
Calling a neighbor saying, hey, can you help me? And being okay with that. Sometimes it's really hard to be vulnerable in that situation. But once someone has walked the road of grief, they understand and are there for one another. And humans, we're all in search of love. What a great way to support your neighbors and your friends and your community by sharing your love in really special ways. Or maybe that's, picking someone up after school and taking the kid for ice cream because
Yes.
mommy or daddy is just having a really hard day.
Yes.
Um, so,
Yes, exactly. And it's great for your kids to see that. Look how my person was willing to ask for help. Look
yeah.
how other people wanted to be a part of helping my family. They must have really cared about my person too. Those
Yeah.
are just really good things.
Yeah, and sharing stories about the loved one from someone who's not in that nuclear family. It's great for
Mhm.
the kids or the adults to hear stories from someone else. Oh yeah, they really were fun and this is, a really funny memory that we have. It kind of
Yes.
lifts it up, right? We talk about always telling stories about the person to keep them alive.
Some people will say like, "Well, I'm worried about bringing it up. What if I make them think of it?" They're not thinking about it. Their
Right.
person is never far from their mind. It is a gift you give them. And if you give them that gift and they cry, that's okay. That's
Hmm.
just a sign of importance, not a sign of you did something wrong. And so the gift is always available.
I love that you talked about crying because I grew up in New England and like a very stoic family and very loving, but we just crying wasn't a thing. And so
Mhm.
I don't think I really cried until I was an adult. And again, we're talking
Mhm.
about grieving and like how important it is to learn how to grieve when you're younger. And I think the conversation around mental health is so much better now than it was when we were younger. So, do you have any things that you say or suggestions to anyone in the community that who might feel uncomfortable crying in front of other people or showing emotion?
Mhm.
Because, right, we have to, the emotions come up because that's energy that needs to be released from our bodies. And
Yes.
if we just like, suck it in, then it really festers and becomes something that we don't want. Any suggestions or advice about really letting the emotions come up and bubble up and giving it space?
Sure. I mean, you're exactly right. This is something, grief or otherwise, that it's good to give ourselves and good to give each other to
Yeah.
allow that permission of emotionality. It might need to start in a space of privacy and then start branching out in small, trusted spaces.
Mm.
Sometimes, you know, I'll hear people say, like, well, I want to cry. I know I need to cry. I'm not sure how to get started. And yet there's probably a song that could help cue you if you really sat there and listened to it, or a scene from a movie or a book. That's why art in any form is so impactful, is because it does help us feel those things. And so perhaps sometimes people need permission to cry for someone else first, as opposed to crying for themselves. And so whether that's something, you know, you're crying for something that happened to somebody in a movie or a news story or whatever, your body is still happy to have the release. And then we often want to eventually be able to do it for ourselves. I think the greatest practice I would love to offer is, if and when you find yourself crying, and if and when you find yourself uncomfortable with that, to do what you can to avoid apologizing for it, because your body hears you say that. And so you can say, I'm uncomfortable with this, or this is unlike me to do that, because those two things are true. And those are two things that we're working on. But let's try not to apologize for it, because there isn't something that needs to be apologized for. You're doing good things, and you're offering someone else a gift by getting to see you do that. And
Mm.
so we can acknowledge the discomfort without wishing we weren't doing it.
Yeah, and also talk about how kids see their parents grieve, and then that's how they learn about
Yes.
grieving. And so
Yes.
if we can be models
Hmm.
of it's okay behavior, right? We're naming it to tame it. Not that we want to tame emotion, but really just normalizing that it's okay to feel this way and being okay with that. But I like that, having some sort of release. And we talk about journaling. And if you wanted to write to the loved one, and maybe that
Hmm.
would help you process some emotions that if you can't verbally get them out, then put it on paper and see how that makes you feel.
Yes.
Or if it's not journaling, maybe it's doodling, right? We
Hmm.
all doodle as kids during class. You know, you're bored and you're like making little things in the margins of the paper. I don't know if students even use paper in schools anymore, but
Yep.
um, they are always creating artwork, or at least my daughter is,
Hmm.
always saying, "Hey, do you have some paper and pen? I just want to draw." And getting out those emotions. One thing, Carrie, I was have a question about. Again, every person experiences grief differently, and
Hmm.
different levels of grief and different times. Like I notice seasonally, things come up. I really struggle in the spring. It's always darkest before dawn, and so like the spring is really hard for me, like as the daffodils are blooming, because my mom always loved daffodils. So, is there, if parents are working with a child who's, struggling with grief, um, is there a point where, like, what if they feel like my child is struggling beyond normal grief? Like, what are there any red flags that we should look out for to really get that child extra support? Um,
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, it's often the same red flags that would be true of any particular struggle. If the child is in any way harming themselves or someone else, if the
mm,
child is talking about harming themselves or someone else. And so that can be literal self-harm, such as cutting. It can be food restrictions. It could be any kind of substance use that is just in a really unhelpful way, a self-medicating way, if you will, a chronic use of any kind.
yeah.
All of that would be immediate elevation to your local community supports, crisis centers, hospitals, all of those things, who know how to come along your side and partner and do some deeper evaluation and some like really immediate interventions. But then I would say there's even some orange flags. Like, we are consistently headed in the wrong direction in hopes to avoid the red flags, which then start, you know, a whole chain of reactions that we'd like to avoid if we can.
Yeah.
So anything like just reducing their sleep, their eating, they're chronically isolating. It's kind of like a vibe check, if you will. But then there's just some also things like they're not contributing, they're intentionally avoiding things that contribute to their well-being, to their basic level of functioning. And whether that's taking care of their body, taking care of themselves socially, totally checked out on schoolwork, those
Mm,
would be some orange flags. And so again, there are some kind of like mid-level places. Schools are usually particularly helpful with those kinds of things, pediatricians, again, for some deeper evaluations and for some good next steps ahead of needing to elevate to crisis centers and hospitals and things like that.
Yeah, that's super helpful because sometimes you can feel so alone as the caregiver of saying,
Yes.
I don't know what to do. And so
Right.
thank you for sharing that. You never know how you'll influence someone's life. I really appreciate
Absolutely.
it.
And
And
again, it's what it communicates to the kid, right? Like
yeah.
something is off enough that we're going to ask some extra people to help us look at this. We're not
Mm,
making decisions yet. We're just going to say, like, I don't know enough and I probably care too much and I'm overthinking this and all the things. And so we're just again going to always keep expanding our team to help us with these things.
hmm Expanding the team. And also I think about it on the end of life with hospice, right? You're expanding
Mhm.
your team and getting extra support to move through this hard life lived experience. Yeah, we talk about community and love and kindness and
Mhm.
being that together. And so if there's a listener that's saying, oh my gosh, this is really resonating with me. This is happening to me now, or I know someone that this is happening to. Where should they start? Is there something that they should first start to say or do? And kind of we're talking about that of, yes, we're all going through this and maybe we just need a little extra support today.
Yeah. It's going to depend often on the child, often on the death experience, how recent that was. But it
Mm,
could even start with, again, that modeling like, hey, I love podcasts and I was listening to this podcast today, and here are two things that I just can't stop thinking about.
mm,
And just put it out there, see what the kiddo responds to. And that's probably more of like an upper elementary all the way through kind of age, starting point. Again, if this is not something that is commonly talked about in the home,
mm.
doing this as a side by side is probably going to be a little bit better than like eye to eye, very serious, So, like, while you go on a walk, while you're driving, while you're preparing dinner together, whatever you can be doing, again, to be active and to just, say, like, here's something I heard. Have you ever heard something like that? Have you ever thought about something like that? And see where it goes. And then you could say, it just reminded me, I wish we talked about this more. Would you ever be willing to talk about that? So we're leading with curiosity, we're leading with permission, we're modeling what something is doing in our hearts. And again, there's no like, and now we've had a right reason, a right exchange, because now the kid has agreed to, or they did answer. The right thing is just that the opportunity was presented. That was the work. That was the gift you gave. And so the rest of it will fall into place many times over multiple discussions.
hmm And that's right, because you want to keep talking about
Mhm.
it in creative ways, if it's
Mhm.
uncomfortable at first, and then you can normalize it later
Yeah.
on after you've done that work. But I love
Mhm.
thinking about it as a side by side and just thinking about it as an adult. What hard things have you moved through where you just needed to go out for a walk and think about that or verbally process things? I love getting outside, right? Because then you're go nature bathing, right? Go
Mhm.
in the woods and just feel that energy and be with that the other
Mhm.
person that's also going through something, and you can be in the woods together or walking down the path. That's a really helpful framework to have. So I'm just so grateful, Carrie, for your time and for really sharing these really impactful nuggets of wisdom that people they're tangible, right? They can take away and implement them today. You don't need anything. And so much a part of it is reaching out, being vulnerable, and being okay with, I'm not okay. And talking about, yes, this person died and
Mhm.
they're not coming back.
Right.
And how can we honor them?
Yes,
Right? What would feel
exactly.
good for you if we could? How do we want to honor your brother, or
Mhm.
how do we want to honor mom? That curiosity, I love that. Asking questions
Mhm.
is so important. And if there are, I know that A Haven has a bunch of resources because, again, we have listeners from all over the world. And so, how can they find you and find some of the digital resources that you have available? And how might that be a support for the
Absolutely.
community?
A Haven's website is ahaven.org, and we have a tab called resources, and we have a number of free printable resources on there. Guidance for, if you just found out that someone important died, how am I going to tell my kid that? There are
Mm,
all different kinds, how to grieve during holidays, transitioning back to school, just some of the common top questions that we get.
yeah.
Those are all available on there. Also, my contact information is on the website. Anybody is really able to call or email at any time if they're just like, hey, this is the part I'm stuck on, and we'd be happy to do some consultation on that. That's at no charge, as I know that could be a question. And then also, I would encourage people to continue to connect in their local communities.
Yes.
You can even Google like your city child grief support to see what might be available near you so that you can start building those local connections. When kids know that there are other kids who go to their school, who are on their soccer team, who are somehow engaged with them, who have had this too, the burden lightens, even though those first steps can feel really hard. And so any opportunity to build into your local community is a great opportunity to support your whole family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that you said that, Carrie, because I feel like in the post-COVID world, so much is a digital space. And whenever we can come off the page and see someone face to face is also super helpful, right? I think both, it's a yes and, right? You can get your support online. There's a large community online, but going to that personal community space, I think that the A Haven model is just so important. So if anyone listening is interested in starting this in their community, we can set you up with a call with Carrie to kind of see all about it. But
Yep.
so there are so many wonderful resources, and
Yes.
we are gifted with Google
Yep.
and ChatGPT or Claude that can help us now find the resources in our area. And also for adults who are at work, many works have an employee assistance program. That's another framework to help those who are grieving and to help find resources in your area. So let them do the research and then tell you what the helpful areas might be for you. So again, it's all about community. So,
Yes.
oh my
Yes.
goodness. Well, thank you so much, Carrie. I'm just grateful for your time and for sharing your wisdom with us. And I really do. You never know how it will impact someone. And so I'm grateful for all that you do and for A Haven being such a light in so many people's lives.
It was great to be together today.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for tuning in, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of Giving Grief Grace. It would be such a gift if you could share this episode with someone and brighten their day. You never know what will happen. Subscribe to get a weekly dose of positivity, and while you're at it, please leave a review. May you be kind to yourself in the week ahead and give yourself grace. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.